Good day, everyone. This is Keith Klain. I am the Executive Vice President for the Association for Software Testing. Thank you all for joining me and our esteemed colleague at the AST, James Bach, to talk today about Drive-In Well Driven, the way of the skilled tester. This is a new series of webinars, the inaugural one today for the Association for Software Testing on the fundamentals or basic tenets of context-driven testing. We have started this webinar series with my co-board member, Ali Moreira, and we've got future broadcasts coming up to discuss topics with Michael Bolton, Anne-Marie Schret, and a few others that we've got in the works. So thank you very much for coming today. We have limited out on the amount of attendees, so that's fantastic news. The topic today is driving well driven, the way of the skilled tester. Everybody in the context-driven testing community pretty much knows who James is. He was one of the co-founders of the context-driven testing school. He was the co-author of Lessons Learned in Software Testing, a context-driven approach. He's a good friend of mine and someone who a lot of people know in the industry, and I'm going to hand over to James and start the webinar. So James, here we go. Hold on. Over to you, James.
Okay. I want to show that screen, and all right, I think you should see my 7 principles up there on the screen right now.
Yes, we do.
And I'm not muted, and you're not muted, so you can speak. All right, so we're in good shape.
Great, we're in good shape.
Okay, hello, folks.
James, to start this off, what we're going to do is talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then people who are listening can ask questions through the question section of the dashboard here. And we'll save those to the end because I think there's some ideas you want to get out before we start taking questions. So to kind of kick things off, how would you describe what context-driven testing is and why it's not just what some people refer to as just common sense?
All right. Well, first, there are 4 links that I gave you that you could put in the chat box for everybody. These 4 links are 4 different documents that have information that will deepen what I'm saying by a lot. So remember to put those out there in the chat. It's weird that when we first came up with these principles, which Kem Kaner and I came up with in a real brainstorm that we had one day while writing our book, and we suddenly decided we should have a manifesto of the context-driven school and what are our basic principles. And I came up with the first 3 of them, and Cam wordsmithed a little bit, and then he added in 4, 5, and 6, and then we kind of said number 7 at the same time. And we always thought these were sort of first draft principles, but over the years they've held up pretty well. What amazed us is how difficult it is for people to understand these principles. We look at them and they make sense to us, and so I suppose, in a sense, they are common sense. They're common sense to CDPT people, in a way, because we understand them. But what we quickly discovered is that many, many, many other people do not understand these principles. Often people look at it and say, well, of course, everything depends on the context. So that's just obvious. And then they proceed to talk about bad ideas, practices that don't work. Even in their context, those practices don't work. So, uh, what we have found over the years of watching people do this is that there are certain specific mistakes people make. And let me go through some of them. First of all, common sense means ubiquitous skill and knowledge, the skill and knowledge that everybody has. So when you say that something is common sense, you're saying that nobody needs to learn anything or say anything about it because we already know.
It's innate
Well,
within, you know, is that context specific as well? Meaning, if you're a tester, whatever that might be, you should have that knowledge, or is it just innate within a human being?
well, I think uh, many people, when they say that CDT is common sense, they probably mean innate within any problem-solving technical person. And I agree that it should be innate, but it actually is not. And we know that it is not because of a question I got just today on Twitter, which is somebody, a stranger to me, asking me out of the blue, James, what process should I follow to test something? And as soon as you say something like that, as soon as that person has spoken, they're showing that they don't even know what a process is, because a process is not something that you follow. A process is something that you are, or something that you embody, or something that you make happen, but it is not something you follow. You can follow procedures, but you can't follow a process. Now, among methodologists, that distinction between procedures and process is common sense, but it is not common sense to most of the people I find who think and speak and even write about software development. They keep confusing the words process and procedure. When basic concepts get regularly mixed up and confused, then common sense turns out not to be common enough. So in CDT, more specifically, a tester is required to criticize common sense, to criticize the things that everybody thinks you should do or everybody thinks are obvious. A CDT tester has the ability, a CDT tester develops the ability, because you don't start out having this ability, to deconstruct and critique what people think is true. This is essential to do the work that we do.
So,
It
James,
is a philosophical skill.
and I will really want to pick up on that just for one second to interrupt. Is that I find that to be, talking to Michael about this, in his view, is it's one of the most masterful skills to be able to do. But so often I find, in particularly mid to junior level context driven testers, the idea of criticism purely has just a negative connotation, not the idea of a critique or thinking, constructive, deconstructing ideas. And how do we change that perception of being just kind of like,
Well, this is another reason why CDT is not common sense, because CDT goes against our entire educational system. The formalized educational system of the West, and I guess East, of the whole world, of the developed world, is based on the idea that you should sit down, shut up, and do what you're told. And that it's based on the idea that there's information that wise people have, and they have to deliver it to you like packages delivered to you by the post office. And they pile up this knowledge at your door, and you're supposed to take it inside and somehow digest it. Nobody knows exactly how that's supposed to work. But that whole attitude that the knowledge is out there, not inside of you, and you have to get that knowledge out there, is part of what's blocking people from learning to be competent technical people and problem solvers. Competent technical people and problem solvers deconstruct and reconstruct knowledge in their minds. Yes, they go out and they hear about things, but then they have to experiment and practice uh, their own skills in order to develop those skills. It's much more like gardening. It's not like going and getting fast food. It's like growing your own potatoes. And yes, you can get advice from another gardener about how to grow your own potatoes, but the other gardeners are not going to be able to grow your potatoes for you.
Right.
That's the basic nature of complicated analytical skills, is that they cannot be grown for you. Now, the common sense issue is one thing, but there's another thing, which is sometimes, very often, people get confused between what's context-specific process and context-driven process. Context-specific is if the things that you are doing are solving problems well in your particular context, well, that's context-specific work, and that's fine. And so a lot of people go, well, my work is, my processes are working for me, my procedures are working for me in my particular context, so that's context-driven, right? No, it isn't. That just means that you're able to do a specific thing at a specific time that isn't wrong. So an analog would be the difference between a child holding a steering wheel straight and not going off the road, and then saying, oh, look, I'm a driver of a car because I can drive straight down a road that has no one else on it and not fly off the road. Well, you can do that one thing and that one thing works, but that doesn't mean that you are a competent driver. A difference between context-driven and context-specific is that context-driven people, they know why their context-specific practices work when they work, and they know when they need to be changed and how to change them when the context changes. So
that's,
if I have a go ahead.
I was going to say, so that's actually really important, because I feel like a lot of people describe themselves as context driven when they're probably just really context aware. And I think those two get conflated quite a bit, because I think the skill you're talking about of being able to change your approach to fit the context is, I think, a key differentiator. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but I see that as something that helps define what being context driven is about.
Well, I can say one little test that you can give yourself to tell if you are definitely not context driven. You can tell immediately, and that's if you only know one way to do something, then you cannot possibly be context driven. So, do you know only one way to document test cases? Do you only know one way to control a project, and that's by documenting test cases? Do you know only one kind of tool to use to automate parts of your work while you test? If you can only think of one thing, and your answer when you're challenged is, well, this works, then you may be context specific, but you are not context driven. The context driven mentality is that we must gain the skills, the judgment to master our tools. We do not work for our tools work for us. So it's very much a difference between a technician, I suppose, and a master craftsman is what I'm talking about. But there's another thing that people sometimes get confused by, and that is what I call context imperial process. Context imperial is behavior where you refuse to work except in certain contexts, or you force the context and you force the other people involved to accommodate your preferred way of working. So agile, for instance, is a context imperial concept. People say, well, agile, that's a better way to work, so I can succeed in an agile project, but I can't succeed in any other kind of project. And then they'll say, but who would want to, because that's a crazy way to work. We are all context imperial to some degree. We all have our preferences. We all would rather work with certain people than with others. Um, it is my preference to work with people who are systems thinkers. It's my preference to work with people who give me everything I want and think that I'm very funny and wonderful. Of course, it's my preference to work with such people, but I won't refuse to work in a situation where I have to work with another strong personality other than me. I develop the skills so that I can adapt to any reasonable degree. Of course, my definition of reasonable isn't infinitely elastic, and there will be situations where I think I'm not going to be able to succeed here, even though someone else might be. So I'm a little bit context imperial. We're all a little context imperial. That's not the same as being context driven, because context driven is to respect the context and solve the problem given the situation that you find yourself in. But it's not wrong to be a little bit context imperial. It is, however, something that we've got to keep an eye on
Well,
to
how would you
keep asking ourselves.
right? How would you contrast that against the best practice crowd? Is because the way you're describing being context imperative.
Here's the way I contrast it. Here's a very simple way I contrast it. The best practice crowd will say this is the best way to work. But when I'm taking responsibility for my context imperiousness, then what I say is, this is what I'm willing to do. This is what I prefer to do. So I take responsibility for that. It's totally okay for somebody to say, here's a practice that I like. Here's a practice that I specialize in.
Right.
Here's a practice that I'm very excited about. Here's a practice that I'm obsessed with. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's responsible. It's honest. It's when you say, no, oh, I'm sorry, it's not me. It's the universe that says this is best. So you're not arguing with me when you don't want to do this practice. You are going up against the universe itself. That is what we object to. We object to the irresponsibility, to the abdication of responsibility that comes when you say that something is a best practice. Now you've set up a sock puppet, fake emperor, and you are really making that guy say whatever you want him to say, but you're pretending like you're not in charge.
So imperialism is more about the environment you're comfortable working in and feel that's right for you. Best practice is more abstract about the right way to do anything and not based on the individual. I think a lot of people get that confused.
Right. So there's a difference between an agilist who says agile is the only way anything should ever be developed, or TDD is a practice everybody should always follow, and saying agile is something I'd like you to try. Come on, try it with me. Well, we'll see how it works together, and if it doesn't work, then we'll modify it a little bit. We'll modify it more. We'll make it work for ourselves, and we're in charge. So there's a very big difference between those two attitudes, and this is why I'm not a member of the agile community, because I cannot stand best practice mentality. So I cannot be in the agile community. But many people in the agile community that I respect do take agile in a kind of context-driven way. They take responsibility for it, and I admire those people, and I have no trouble with those people. But unfortunately, if I want to go hang out with them at their conferences, I have to be surrounded by a whole lot of people who say, you should just shut up and use cucumber.
Well, I think as well, my experience with the agile community is that, one, it's a very slippery slope from imperialism into the best practice world. And then as two, you hear a lot of, well, you're just not doing it right. That it's not context specific. You're doing it wrong somehow. And that seems to be pretty pervasive in a lot of the agile community.
Oh, and that's a very fair thing to say. I mean, I might be doing it wrong. But to say I know for sure you're doing it wrong if it's not working, and it's instead of maybe that kind of process is not the best way to approach this situation. To to say I know for sure that you must be doing it wrong because there cannot possibly be anything wrong with the process in this context. That's the mistake. That's the fundamental arrogance that we try to avoid in CDT.
Right.
People sometimes say that they sometimes find that CDT people are arrogant, and I guess I give off, and lots of people like me give off signs of arrogance, and that may be because we work really hard to be good at what we do, and we are proud of that, and we are, I think, justifiably proud of that, and we are pretty annoyed with the bulk of the world who seem not to be even interested in developing their skills. And so that absolutely can create a certain kind
I
of
think there's some of that, and there's also,
cockiness.
yeah, yeah. There's also, I find people are so attached to their ideas when you come across someone who is a professional questioner, right? Or someone who's going to not just take what you say at face value and deconstructs it and puts it back together so they understand it and we all understand it better. I think a lot of that is closely tied to, well, my ideas are me. And if you don't like my ideas, well, then you don't like me. And we get a frowny face after that. So my experience has been, and I try not to surround myself with people like that, so attached to their ideas that they can't take criticism. My experience has been there's an element of that. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something else that you were talking about, James. Is so we're talking about context-driven testers and what the mind frame and kind of the central tenets of those are. Can you give us an example of where a problem or a context where someone who's a context-driven tester would react differently to someone who was a factory school or an analytical school or a different school? What are some of the differences in how someone in the context-driven testing school would approach a problem?
Well, typically, context-driven people come up against the factory school mentality, which is very, very popular. It's popular because it's such a pleasant fantasy for management, for people who don't know how to test. They want to make machines do the work instead. They want to dehumanize the work so that they don't have to be beholden to those crazy humans to scale up and do all the things that they want to do. So a factory schooler tends to approach a situation by saying, what is the procedure? Their first thought is, what is the procedure? And if there's no procedure, they say, we have to create a procedure. And they also tend to then reify the procedure. Reification means to make concrete. So they will immediately say, well, let's make a document that has the procedure on it, and then they confuse the document with the procedure. It's someone who thinks that in business that if you have a contract with someone, that the contract is the relationship and not the way the people feel about the contract or what their understanding of the contract is. So often you see in among management the idea that
those people have probably never been sued because it's very rarely about what's actually written.
absolutely. I mean, as soon as you get involved in the legal process on any level, you realize how rubbery the law is, how there's little tiny words make a huge
It's all about
difference in people's intent.
Yeah.
Say again?
I said it's about intent and interpretation. It's what did we
Absolutely.
actually mean when we said that, and you very rarely find that out until there's a dispute.
Right. Well, I was in a court case once where I was testing to see if something infringed a patent. And so I had to read the patent. And of course, the patent was full of words like the word transmission, which were never defined. And I said, well, how do we know what that word means? And they said, well, it just depends on what a normal person skilled in the art would think that it means. And I said, yeah, that's the problem, is there's lots of different definitions. So what I had to do in that court case is I had to test against every single plausible definition of every single significant word, which meant that there were, practically speaking, about a dozen different possible meanings of the patent, and I had to test against all of those meanings. And then after that process, the judge made a ruling about what the actual definitions are. It's
Right.
a normal part of a patent infringement case. It's called a Markman hearing. But the thing is the judge doesn't do that at the start of the process. He does it almost at the end of the process. So what you have to do as a tester on such a case is you have to imagine all the different things the judge might say and test against all of those possibilities. Now, CDTers are often accused of asking a million questions and always wondering what the definitions of words are and never locking themselves down. But this is a case where that's exactly what was needed. And we won that case. And part of the reason we won it is because I did test with many different contingent understandings of the specification in mind. Now, I want to say a few things about what CDT, about what the difference is between the specific differences are. It's already said that a factory schooler wants to be given a specific spec that means one thing. They want to write down their procedures or to be given their procedures. They're trying to make things into an algorithm with little judgment. They think that that is a good thing. And it is good if you can actually find the bugs doing that. My problem is that I don't believe you can find important bugs by doing that.
Mm-hmm.
A context-driven guy, by contrast, wants to find out what's going on the project. Their top priority is, what do I have to work with? What are the relevant variables? What are the status of those relevant variables? Who matters? Who do I serve? Those things must be established. It is of vanishingly little importance to worry about what the procedures are, because we're going to create the procedures as we go. And a CDT person is reluctant to formalize until the last minute, because formalization limits our ability to solve problems, and we are problem solvers. So I want to find those bugs. I don't know exactly where they are. I don't know exactly what kind of tests I need to use to find them. So I'm going to postpone formalization, whereas a non-CDT person who is grasping onto these best practices is going to want to be told what to do, and it's going to want to formalize early rather than formalizing late. They will then be locked into whatever the decisions they make. But because that doesn't work, and anyone who's actually tried to use factory school stuff knows that it doesn't work, halfway through the project you find yourself either ripping up your documents or living with the fact that you are surrounded by obsolete documents that everybody knows aren't accurate. And I keep seeing this cynical fatalism throughout these projects where you point to a document and you say, this document says you're supposed to do this. And they go, yeah, but you know, that's just a document and we have to pretend to do that. Well, why do you just delete the document? Oh, management wants it. So this fiction, there's all this energy by testers devoted to maintaining a fiction that apparently they think that their parents need them to maintain. And I say parents in a, you know, smirky way, but it's exactly like a child who is trying to keep his parents from yelling at him. And now personally, I'm an adult.
Right.
I no longer worry about my father yelling at me, and I feel that way about my clients. I'm an adult, and I'm going to do a good job, and if my client doesn't like it, then he should damn well fire me. But I'm not going to go through my work life worried that I'm going to be displeasing someone who doesn't even know how to test.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes back to, and because that environment you're talking about is pervasive in the software testing industry, and it is reinforced. And although there are significant cracks in the veneer, when I go back to the example of like healthcare.gov, which was tested using that exact principle, and the fairly well documented issues that they had. So I think there's big moneyed interests that want to keep that style in play. But I think there's some cracks there. But it's a lot of the folks that we've come across in the last year or so with Thorne Jones, then as well, hiring people into it all over the place at Barclays or other places I've been. People don't have the tools or the vocabulary to break out from that worldview, and I think that's a big place that context-driven testing can really make big changes, because people will create those ridiculous documents, and yes, you're right. Everybody knows that they're useless and does them anyway, but it's like this lack of, I don't know what else to do. So I would extend your child parent analogy a little bit, because it's almost like an adult kid living at home with his parents, where you
Right,
could go get your
right.
own
I
job
get
and
it.
you could
Okay.
go do something differently,
I,
but you just don't know how to go get a job.
well, I think you put your finger on a very fundamental thing. I think there are two very fundamental problems in our industry from which almost all the problems flow. Well, I guess you could say there's one overarching problem, which is human ambition knows no bounds. People keep wanting to do things that they don't know how to do because maybe they'll make a lot of money. So that is the prime problem that everything else that causes every other problem in any technology project is people just won't stop even when they know that they're out of control, because they go, well, maybe we'll get rich like those other people did, and sometimes they do. But the other problem is the two problems underneath that. One is incompetent middle management. So middle management that doesn't know how to develop people who work for them, and they don't know how to trust the people that work for them. They don't know how to find people that they're willing to trust. So there you have a whole certification thing in our industry. So we have that problem of incompetent middle management, which is your area of expertise specifically, Keith. You're the guy in our field who has decided to make a study of how management should be and how we should talk to management. And we need a lot more of that in our field. But the other part of it, the part that I specialize in, is it's difficult to develop the skills of thinking and analysis so that you don't feel you have to grasp at those best practice straws. And I specialize in the processes by which people can be developed over time into craftsmen. And that's one of the links that I gave people is my link to my presentation called Building an Analyst. And it's a overview of the issues involved in growing somebody from being unable to think abstractly to being able to think abstractly. And it's unfortunately a process that is not just you take a pill and you can do it, but it means that you have to struggle over time. There's one of my esteemed colleagues is Damian Sinanidos, who is in the middle of doing this. He's in the middle of developing himself from being a merely experienced tester into being a real testing craftsman. And so today on one of the chat rooms, he's talking about this philosophical question of whether it is possible for something to have no value for anyone ever. And on the face of it, that's kind of a silly question. But questions like that and arguing about them is part of how we develop the skills to answer more practical questions, such as is this particular thing valuable here and now? And he knows that. So he has the patience, unlike most people, to play with these abstract philosophical issues because he knows he's sharpening his mental
Right.
scalpel so that he can do the work he needs to do. But so many people just think, oh, that's just philosophy. That's not really necessary. What you really should do is read a manual about gherkin and cucumber and practice saying things in gherkin language. That will make you better. And I'm not saying that that's a useless thing to do, but I am saying that if you don't have basic analytical skills and the patience with difficult philosophical problems, you also won't have the patience to understand what the real technical problem is that is facing you, and you may not have the courage and the strength and the conviction to see that through. And in the CBT world, we believe it's important to develop those qualities.